I am Hamish Macbeth, and welcome to the Crimson Noir.
The morning sky over Lochdebuff was an aggressive, unblinking blue. It was a crisp, cloudless Highland day, the kind where the frost lay so thick on the heather, it crunched like crushed glass beneath a heavy boot. Up on the steep, craggy incline of the home farm, Police Constable Hamish Macbeth sat comfortably on a weathered stone dike, a battered thermos of coffee resting on his knee. Below, his police station sat silent and ignored. The telephone inside might have been ringing, demanding reports and statistics for headquarters in Strathbane. But up here, the only sounds were the wind off the sea loch and the occasional bleat of a black-faced sheep. Hamish took a long, slow swallow of the scalding coffee. Feeling the heat spread pleasantly through his chest, his mongrel dog, Towser, lay at his feet, nose tucked firmly under his tail against the biting chill. This was Hamish's preferred method of policing, observing the village from a safe, unreachable distance, thereby preventing any actual work from finding him. However, the cold crispness of the air eventually brought a sharp, undeniable hollow to his stomach. His own pantry contained nothing but half a tin of stale beans and a heel of bread that could break a window. With a mournful sigh, Hamish screwed the cup back onto his thermos, unfolded his long, lanky frame, and began the slow trudge down the hillside. He pointed his boots toward the Lochdebuff Hotel, calculating exactly how pathetic he needed to look to convince Mrs. Anstruther to part with a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon on credit. He strolled along the waterfront, his peaked cap pulled low over his fiery red hair, looking for all the world like a man with not a single pressing thought in his head. But as he pushed open the heavy oak door of the hotel, the comforting smell of frying bacon was entirely overpowered by the sharp, grating sound of a raised English voice. In the center of the lobby stood Reginald Thorne. Thorne was a Sassenach of the most exhausting variety. He had arrived the previous afternoon via the rattling local bus, dragging several heavy steamer trunks and an attitude of profound, imperial entitlement. He was a dealer in antiquities and rare ecclesiastical artifacts, a man who viewed the Scottish Highlands not as a home, but as a dusty attic ripe for plundering. Thorne was currently directing his ire at the mild-mannered church beadle, a small, nervous man named Geordie, who was backing away toward the reception desk. "It is an absolute tragedy," Thorne barked, adjusting the lapels of his pristine, heavy wool blazer. "A dereliction of cultural duty. That church of yours is sitting on a hoard of 17th century silver and carved oak that is practically rotting in the damp. I have offered the parish council a more than generous sum for the artifacts, and yet I am stonewalled by a committee of village simpletons who would rather see history crumble than sell it to someone who appreciates it." Geordie wrung his hands, his eyes darting around for rescue. "It's not for selling, Mr. Thorne. The silver belongs to the kirk. It's been there since the Covenanters. The minister says—" "The minister," Thorne interrupted with a sneer, "is a sentimental fool sitting on a gold mine he doesn't understand." Hamish ambled forward, his footsteps heavy and deliberately slow. He stopped a few feet from Thorne, hooking his thumbs into his utility belt, his hazel eyes wide and entirely vacant. "Well now, sir," Hamish said, his voice a soft, meandering Highland drawl. "It is horrible, damp, but the silver seems to have survived the last 300 years without catching a cold. I imagine it'll survive a few more." Thorne pivoted, his eyes raking over Hamish's slightly frayed uniform and unkempt hair. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. "And you must be the local law enforcement. I was warned the policing here was somewhat rustic. Tell me, Constable, do you spend all your time loitering in hotels, or do you occasionally pretend to work?" Hamish blinked slowly, letting a dopey, good-natured smile spread across his face. "Oh, I work, Mr. Thorne. Just this morning, I had to break up a very tense standoff between two of my rams. It takes a delicate touch, you see." Thorne rolled his eyes in exasperation. "Good heavens. I am surrounded by agrarian incompetence. I am going to the church archives, and I demand that I not be harassed by superstitious locals while I conduct my appraisal." He turned on his heel and marched out of the hotel, the door slamming violently behind him. The lobby descended into a stunned silence. Hamish looked at the trembling beadle, then turned toward the dining room, his mind already piecing together. The friction Thorn was sowing. The Sassenach was a man digging his fingers into the village's sacred history, driven by greed and a total disregard for the people who lived there. It was a dangerous game to play in Lochdoverf. "Well, Geordie," Hamish murmured, pulling out a chair at an empty table, "I think that man is going to find that our history has a very sharp edge to it. Now, do you think Mrs. Anstruther might have a spare plate of bacon to settle my nerves? Yeah?" The heavy oak door of the Lochdover Hotel had barely ceased its indignant rattling when Mrs. Anstruther appeared from the kitchen, her face a thundercloud of repressed Highland fury. She set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of Hamish with a sharp clatter that made the silver jump. "That man," she hissed, wiping her hands on an apron that smelled faintly of lavender and bleach, "has the manners of a rutting stag and the heart of a midwinter gale. Calling us simpletons. I should have charged him triple for his room and half again for the insult to the minister." Hamish nodded sympathetically, his mouth already full of the best bacon in the county. He let the wave of local resentment wash over him, filing away the names of those Thorn had offended in the last 24 hours. It was a long list, including nearly everyone with a pulse and a Highland grandmother. Hamish finished his breakfast with a slow, deliberate relish, savouring the peace that Thorn's departure had temporarily restored to the dining room. He was just reaching for a second pot of coffee when the silence of the village was shattered by a sound that didn't belong to a crisp, clear morning. It was a high, thin wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that seemed to echo off the mountains and settle like a cold shroud over the loch. Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound of a man whose day of avoiding work had just met a violent end. He stood up, adjusted his cap, and whistled for Towser. The scream had come from the direction of the old kirk, a grey stone building that stood like a weary sentinel on the edge of the village. As Hamish rounded the corner of the cemetery wall, he saw Geordie, the beadle, stumbling toward him, his face the colour of damp parchment. The little man was pointing a trembling finger toward the heavy iron-studded door of the church archives. "He's there, Hamish, in the vault, the Englishman. He's gone and done it now." Hamish pushed past the sobbing beadle, his long legs eating up the distance to the stone stairs that led down into the damp, subterranean heart of the church. The air in the vault was thick with the smell of wet stone and ancient, rotting paper. It was a cramped, claustrophobic space, illuminated only by a single, flickering, electric bulb that dangled from a frayed cord. In the center of the room, slumped against a massive 17th-century oak chest, was Reginald Thorn. The Sassenach's pristine wool blazer was ruined, covered in a fine layer of grey stone dust. He was dead, his eyes wide, and bulging with an expression of profound, indignant surprise. But it was the manner of his death that made Hamish pause and scratch his red hair in bewilderment. Thorn had been pinned to the oak chest by a massive, ceremonial Highland broadsword, an artifact that had hung above the altar for 300 years. The blade had passed through his expensive silk tie and pinned him to the wood, like a butterfly in a collector's case. However, the sword hadn't pierced his flesh. It had missed his neck by a fraction of an inch. Thorn had not been stabbed. His face was a mottled, angry purple, and his hands were clawed at his throat. Beside him, an empty, ornate silver chalice lay on the floor, its contents spilled into the dust. The smell of bitter almonds hung heavy and sickly in the stagnant air. "Right then," Hamish murmured, more to himself than to the ghost of the dead man. "A very untidy way to go, Mr. Thorn." He knelt beside the body, his hazel eyes scanning the room with a sharp, hidden intensity that belied his sleepy expression. There were no signs of a struggle, no muddy footprints other than Thorn's own, and the heavy iron key to the vault was still turned in the lock from the inside. It looked like a classic locked room mystery, the kind of puzzle that delighted city detectives and gave Hamish a pounding headache. He reached out a large, freckled hand and touched the rim of the silver chalice. It was part of the very hoard Thorn had been so desperate to appraise. The Sassenach had died in the middle of his plunder, a victim of his own greed and perhaps a very Highland brand of justice. Hamish stood up, his joints protesting the cold dampness of the vault. He knew that within the hour, the peace of Lochdubuff would be a memory. The sirens would start, the forensics teams would descend, and worst of all, Detective Chief Inspector Blair would arrive from Strathbane to turn his village into a circus. Hamish looked at Towser, who was whining at the top of the stairs. "Well, boy," he sighed, "I suppose we'd better call the professionals. My quiet day is officially over." The damp, oppressive silence of the vault was short-lived, replaced by a sound that Hamish Macbeth loathed more than a dry well or a missing salmon. The distant, rhythmic wail of a police siren began to bounce off the surrounding mountains, growing louder and more abrasive until it tore through the morning mist of Lochdubuff like a jagged blade. Hamish stood by the heavy iron door, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, watching as a mud-spattered police van roared up the Kirk's gravel path, skidding to a halt just inches from a row of ancient, moss-covered gravestones. The doors flew open with a violence that suggested the occupants were clearing a path through a riot rather than arriving at a house of God. Detective Chief Inspector Blair stomped out of the vehicle, his face already a dangerous pulsating shade of crimson that clashed horribly with his cheap, mustard-colored tie. Behind him trailed the perpetually exhausted Detective Jimmy Anderson, looking as though he had already spent the entire drive being shouted at in the cramped confines of the van. Blair didn't bother with greetings. He simply pushed past Geordie the Beadle, nearly knocking the little man into a hedge, and made a beeline for the church entrance, where Hamish stood waiting with a look of vacant, bovine indifference. "Out of the way, Macbeth," Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the kirk and causing a parliament of crows to take flight from the belfry in a black, flapping panic. "What have you been doing? Standing here like a garden gnome while a taxpayer is murdered. I might have known you'd be useless the moment a real crime occurred. You probably haven't even secured the perimeter. You lanky streak of Highland misery." Blair pushed his way down the narrow stone stairs into the vault, his heavy boots obliterating any delicate dust patterns Hamish had been quietly studying. He stopped in the centre of the vault, his eyes bulging as he took in the sight of Reginald Thorne, pinned to the oak chest by the ceremonial broadsword. For a moment, even Blair was struck dumb by the sheer, theatrical absurdity of the scene. He stared at the silver chalice, the spilled liquid, and the mottled, purple face of the Sassenach dealer. "Good God," Blair whispered, before his usual arrogance returned with a vengeance. "It's a ritual killing, a bloody Highland sacrifice. I knew this village was full of primitive savages. Anderson, get the photographer down here immediately. And you, Macbeth, get out of my light. You've likely trampled all over every piece of evidence within a 5-mile radius, with those great, clod-hopping boots of yours." Hamish remained perfectly still, his hazel eyes drifting toward the ceiling, as if he were contemplating the weather. "It's a locked room, sir," Hamish offered in his softest, most infuriatingly slow Highland drawl. "The key was inside, and it smells of bitter almonds. I don't think the sword was the thing that did it for him, though it certainly makes a statement." Blair rounded on him, his neck veins throbbing. "Don't you try to teach me my job, you rustic imbecile. I can see he's poisoned. It's obvious what happened here. This Thorne fellow comes up here, flashes his money around, insults the locals, and one of you peasants decides to play at being a judge and executioner. Who was it he was arguing with? I want a name, and I want it now." "He had words with many people, sir," Hamish replied, scratching his red hair with a deceptive air of confusion. "But he was particularly hard on poor Geordie the Beadle, and he had a row with the minister over church money. Then there was Mrs. Wellington at the shop who didn't like his tone." Blair didn't wait for him to finish. He snapped his thick fingers at Anderson. "The Beadle, the little nervous one, he's the most obvious suspect. He has the keys, he was the one who found the body, and he probably lacks the backbone to stand up to a man like Thorne any other way. Anderson, get him into the van. I'll break him in 20 minutes. But sir," Hamish murmured, his voice barely a whisper, "Geordie wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone a man with a broadsword." Blair let out a sound like a steam engine reaching its limit. "Shut your mouth, Macbeth. You are officially off this case. Go direct traffic on the pier, or whatever it is you do to pretend you earn a wage. Leave real policing to the professionals. I'll have a confession before my tea, and you'll still be trying to figure out which end of a notebook is which. As Blair stomped back up the stairs, his boots echoing with self-importance, Hamish looked at the empty silver chalice and the way the light hit the dust. He knew Blair was heading in the wrong direction at a high rate of speed. But he wasn't about to correct him. He had his own way of finding the truth, and it started with a long, quiet walk through the village. The heavy slam of the police van's doors echoed through the kirkyard. A final, jarring punctuation mark to DCI Blair's departure. Hamish stood in the damp grass, his lanky frame hunched against the biting Highland wind, and watched the tail lights disappear toward the village police station. Blair was convinced that a terrified Geordie was the key to a simple, thuggish crime of passion, and he was currently halfway toward terrifying the poor beadle into a false confession. Hamish, however, knew that Geordie couldn't lift a ceremonial broadsword without getting a hernia, let alone pin a grown man to an oak chest with it. Furthermore, Geordie smelled of nothing but floor wax and old hymn books. He didn't possess the cold, calculating mind required to prepare a draught of cyanide. "Right then, Towser," Hamish murmured, the dog looking up with a skeptical whine. "Since the professionals are busy shouting at the innocent, I suppose we'd best find out what the guilty are up to." He didn't follow Blair to the station. Instead, he turned his back on the crime scene and trudged through the village toward the general store. His stomach gave a sharp, indignant growl, reminding him that the drama of the morning had effectively cheated him out of his breakfast. In Lockduff, information was rarely found in an interrogation room. It was baked into the crust of a meat pie, or stirred into a third dram of whiskey. He headed first to the back door of the Lockdover Hotel. Mrs. Anstruther was in the kitchen, her face a mask of grim determination as she pummeled a mound of dough. The air was thick with the scent of yeast and roasting ham. "Hamish Macbeth," she barked without looking up. "I suppose you're looking for a free handout, while that poor Sassenach is still cooling in the vault. I heard Blair is back. The man's a menace to peace." "He is that, Mrs. R," Hamish said, sliding onto a wooden stool and looking mournful. "He's got Geordie in the station right now. Thinks he's a ritual murderer. It's a terrible strain on a man's nerves, seeing such injustice." Mrs. Anstruther snorted, but she reached for a plate and piled it high with thick slices of ham and a generous dollop of mustard. "Injustice? The injustice is that Thorne poked his nose into things that didn't concern him. He was in here yesterday afternoon, drinking mineral water, and asking far too many questions about the church silver and the old parish records." Hamish paused with a forkful of ham halfway to his mouth. "The parish records, I thought. He was an art dealer." Mrs. Anstruther wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes narrowing. "He claimed to be, but he spent 3 hours in the corner with the postmistress, Mrs. Wellington, and she wasn't selling him stamps, Hamish. They were arguing. I caught a bit of it when I brought over his bill. Something about a lost inheritance and a stolen name. He told her that if the truth came out, half the village would be looking for new houses." Hamish chewed slowly, his mind whirring beneath his deceptive, sleepy gaze. If Thorne was digging into the archives, he wasn't just looking at the silver. He was looking at the skeletons in the village closet. He finished his ham, thanked Mrs. Anstruther with a wink that promised a future favor, and sloshed his way back to the general store. The shop was empty of customers, the bell giving a lonely chime as he entered. Mrs. Wellington was sitting by the stove, her face pale and her hands unusually still. "He was a nasty man, Hamish," she said, before he could even speak. "A nasty, prying man who thought he could come up here and undo 50 years of history just because he had a fancy degree." Hamish leaned against the counter, looking as though he might fall asleep at any moment. "History is a heavy thing to carry, Mrs. Wellington. Was he bothering you about the Brodie family? Or perhaps someone closer to home?" She didn't answer, but her eyes darted toward a small locked cabinet behind the till where the old ledger books were kept. "He found something he shouldn't have," she whispered, "and he thought he could use it to make himself rich. He didn't understand that in Lockduff we keep our own secrets. Hamish nodded, his red hair dusted with the light rain that had begun to fall. He had learned more in 20 minutes of mooching than Blair would learn in 10 hours of bullying. Thorn hadn't been killed for his wallet. He'd been killed because he was a blackmailer who had underestimated the fierce, silent loyalty of the Highlands. As he retreated into the cold, Hamish knew his next stop wouldn't be the station. He needed to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe, if there was a secret worth killing for in the parish records. The local aristocracy would surely have heard a whisper of it. The rain in Lochtabuff had transitioned from a light dusting to a steady, rhythmic drumming that turned the gravel paths into treacherous grey rivers. Hamish trudged up the long, winding driveway toward Castle Halberton, his shoulders hunched and his hands deep in the pockets of his heavy greatcoat. The grand stone edifice loomed out of the mist like a weary giant, its many windows staring blankly at the choppy waters of the sea loch below. Hamish felt the usual tug of inadequacy that accompanied a visit to the castle, a feeling exacerbated by his damp uniform and the lingering scent of Mrs. Anstruther's mustard on his breath. He wasn't there to report a crime. Blair was currently doing enough of that for 10 men, but to find a sounding board. Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the colonel's daughter, possessed a sharp, cool intellect that often saw through the social pretenses Hamish found so baffling. He was halfway to the heavy oak doors when a silver Land Rover purred up behind him, its tires crunching effortlessly through the mud. The window slid down, revealing Priscilla's aristocratic features, framed by a silk headscarf that probably cost more than Hamish's annual boot allowance. She looked at him with a mixture of amusement and genuine concern. "Hamish," she said, her voice like clear water over Highland stones. "I heard the news. The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive. Is it true about the broadsword?" Hamish leaned against the cold metal of the door, removing his cap to reveal a shock of damp, fiery hair. "It is, Priscilla. A very messy business, and made all the messier by DCI Blair, who is currently convinced the beetle is a ritualistic assassin." Priscilla killed the engine and stepped out, her movements graceful despite the treacherous footing. She led him toward the side entrance, a smaller, warmer door that led directly into the library. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax, a welcome change from the biting wind. "Geordie," Priscilla asked, shedding her coat, "that's ridiculous. He wouldn't hurt a fly, though he might lecture on its Sunday attendance. But Thorn, he was a different matter entirely. He was here last week, Hamish." He cornered Papa in the study, talking about the legitimacy of local holdings and the genealogical inconsistencies in the parish registers. Hamish sank into a leather armchair that felt like it might swallow him whole. Did he know? And how did the colonel take to that? Priscilla walked over to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of sherry, handing one to Hamish. Papa told him to get out before he set the dogs on him. But Thorn wasn't deterred. He claimed that a branch of the family, the ones who originally endowed the Kirkhives, had a secret that would invalidate half the land deeds in Lochtabuff. He called it the Great Highland Fraud. Hamish took a sip of the sherry, the warmth blooming in his chest. "A fraud, is it?" Mrs. Wellington at the shop seemed very rattled by him too. She mentioned a stolen name and a lost inheritance. Priscilla sat opposite him, her blue eyes narrowing. "That sounds like the old story of the lost Brodies. There was a rumor a century ago that the true heir to the estate wasn't the one who inherited, but a child born on the wrong side of the blanket who was spirited away. If Thorn found proof of that in the archives, he wasn't just an art dealer. He was a blackmailer holding a knife to the throat of the village's establishment." Hamish stared at the amber liquid in his glass, the pieces of the puzzle shifting. Thorn hadn't just been looking at the silver. He had been looking for a lever to upend the very foundations of the village. "But who would know?" Priscilla asked, leaning forward. "Only someone with constant access to the Kirk. Someone who knows the rhythms of the manse better than anyone." Hamish nodded slowly, his mind returning to the iron rust smudge he had noticed on a sleeve earlier that morning. "And someone who knows that Thorn was a greedy, arrogant man who could be lured into a trap by the promise of more evidence." He stood, placing the empty glass on a mahogany table. "Thank you for the sherry, Priscilla. It cleared my head better than the Highland air." She watched him go, a small, worried frown on her face. "Be careful, Hamish. Blair is looking for a scapegoat, and if you get in his way, he'll have you transferred to a rainy beat in Glasgow before the week is out." Hamish smiled, a slow, deceptive lilt to his lips. "I've no intention of going to Glasgow, Priscilla. Coffee is too bitter." The heavy oak doors of Castle Halberton closed with a dull, final thud behind Hamish, leaving him once more in the embrace of the relentless Highland rain. The Silver Land Rover remained a shimmering ghost in the mist as he trudged back down the long driveway, his mind churning faster than the grey waters of the loch. Priscilla's words about the lost Brodies and a potential inheritance fraud hung in the air like the smell of damp peat. If Reginald Thorne had indeed stumbled upon proof that the current village power structures were built on a century-old lie, he hadn't just been an annoying Sassenach, he had been a walking demolition charge. And in a place like Lochdevoff, where history was as solid as the granite mountains, people would kill to keep the foundation from cracking. As he reached the bottom of the hill, the blue flashing lights of a police van cut through the gloom, reflecting off the whitewashed walls of the village station. Hamish arrived just in time to see DCI Blair stomping out onto the pavement. His face a triumphant, glowing shade of violet. Behind him, a shivering and tearful Geordie the Beadle was being led toward the back of the van by Detective Jimmy Anderson. The little man looked smaller than ever, his oversized tweed coat sagging under the weight of the rain and his own terror. "There he is," Blair roared, spotting Hamish. "The village idiot returns from his afternoon stroll. Well, Macbeth, you can stop scratching your red head. I've cracked it. A motive as old as the hills, greed, and a desperate cover-up. We found the incriminating evidence right in the Beadle's cottage, tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of the Book of Common Prayer. A vial of cyanide, half empty, and a set of keys to the vault that he forgot to mention he possessed." Hamish stayed where he was, leaning against a frozen lamppost, looking for all the world like a man who had accidentally wandered into the wrong film. "Keys, sir?" Hamish asked, his voice soft and deceptively vacant. "And did Geordie admit to using them? Or perhaps to lift that great broadsword all by himself?" Blair snorted, a sound of pure, concentrated arrogance. "He doesn't have to admit it. The evidence speaks for itself. He was seen arguing with Thorne yesterday about the silver, and he was the only one with the opportunity to spike the man's drink. As for the sword, it was a theatrical touch to make it look like a local legend, a classic misdirection that failed because he was dealing with a professional. He's going to Strathbane tonight, and I'm calling the chief constable to report a closed case. You can go back to your sheep and your poaching. You're lucky I don't charge you with obstruction for your sheer, staggering incompetence." "But, sir," Hamish scratched his red hair looking thoughtful, "Geordie has a tremor in his hands, so bad he can barely pour a cup of tea without splashing the saucer, to handle a delicate poison, and then arrange a heavy antique sword. It seems a bit of a stretch for a man who can't even bait a fishing hook." "Don't you try to teach me about criminal capability," Blair snapped, poking a thick finger into Hamish's chest. "Fair, Macbeth, fear and adrenaline. He's going down, and I'm taking the credit for cleaning up your messy backyard." He climbed into the van, slamming the door with a finality that made the windows rattle. As the vehicle roared away, skidding on the wet corner, Hamish stood alone in the rain. He looked toward the Beadle's empty cottage, then toward the general store where Mrs. Wellington was currently pulling down the blinds for the night. The evidence in Geordie's house was far too perfect, the timing too convenient, and the motive too tidy. Someone had wanted the police to find that vial, and they had known exactly where Blair's predictable vanity would lead him. Hamish whistled low for Towser, who emerged from the lee of a stone wall. He wasn't thinking about Geordie anymore. He was thinking about the invisible person who handled the village's keys, cleaned the Kirk silver, and knew exactly where everyone spent their afternoons. He needed to find the one person who had been helpful enough to point Blair toward the Beadle's cottage in the first place. The red herring was beginning to stink, and the real killer was likely sitting down to a nice quiet supper, convinced that the simple policeman was as blind as the inspector. The red taillights of the police van flickered like dying embers before vanishing into the heavy charcoal mist of the Highland evening. Hamish stood in the middle of the road, Lockdub's silence returning with a weight that felt almost physical. Beside him, the rain continued its rhythmic assault, washing away the muddy tracks left by DCI Blair's arrogance. The professional investigation was heading toward Strathbane at 60 miles an hour, carrying a terrified, innocent beadle toward a cold cell. Hamish reached out a large, freckled hand and patted Towser's wet head, a gesture of quiet solidarity. He knew the cyanide in Geordie's prayer book was a theatrical plant, designed to exploit Blair's love for a sensationalist arrest. Someone in this village was playing a very clever game, using the Sassenach Thorn's greed as a shield for a much older, deeper resentment that had nothing to do with silver and everything to do with blood. "Right then, Towser," Hamish murmured, his voice a soft, low rumble that barely carried over the wind. "Since the great detective has finished his work, I suppose we'd best start ours." He did not return to the warmth of police custody. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the small, neat cottage nestled against the kirkyard wall, the home of Mrs. Kennedy, the church cleaner, and the village's most prolific source of helpful observations. It was Mrs. Kennedy who had whispered to Blair about Geordie's secret keys, and it was Mrs. Kennedy who always seemed to be polishing the silver whenever Thorn had been sniffing around the archives. Hamish walked slowly, his long legs eating up the distance with a deceptive, lazy grace. He found Mrs. Kennedy in her garden, frantically pulling wet laundry from a line despite the downpour. She was a small, bird-like woman with eyes that moved like a nervous robin's. As Hamish approached the gate, the scent of bitter almonds, faint but unmistakable, seemed to drift on the damp breeze, emanating not from the church, but from the open doorway of her kitchen. "A terrible night for the washing, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish said, leaning over the fence with a vacant, pleasant smile. The woman jumped, dropping a damp sheet into the mud. Her face, usually a mask of pious concern, twisted into a sudden, jagged look of terror before she smoothed it over. "Oh, Hamish, you gave me such a fright. I was just thinking of poor Geordie. To think we had a murderer in our midst all these years. DCI Blair says he's as good as confessed." Hamish scratched his red hair, looking thoughtfully at the sheet in the mud. "Is that so? Blair is a very persuasive man, to be sure. But tell me, Mrs. Kennedy, did you ever hear the old stories about the lost Brodies?" Thorn seemed very interested in them. He thought the true heir to the estate was still living right here in Lockdubboff, perhaps under a different name entirely. The woman's hands froze on the clothesline. The nervous robin in her eyes went still, replaced by something cold and ancient. "Stories are just stories, Macbeth," she hissed, her voice losing its sugary village lilt. Thorn was a man who liked to dig up graves that were meant to stay shut. He thought he could come here with his London manners and tell us who we are. He thought he could take the silver that my great-grandfather died protecting during the clearances. The motive was suddenly as bare as the winter hills. It wasn't just about the lost Brodie inheritance, though Mrs. Kennedy's maiden name had been Brodie before a tactical marriage 50 years ago. It was about the physical history of the Kirk. Thorn hadn't just found a secret heir. He had found proof that Mrs. Kennedy had been systematically borrowing the church's minor artifacts for decades, replacing them with clever fakes she'd sourced through her own quiet connections. Thorn had been blackmailing her, threatening to expose her as a thief and strip her of the only thing she valued, her standing as the most respected woman in the parish. She hadn't killed him for money. She had killed him to preserve the lie of her life. She had used the broadsword to frame a ritual killing, knowing the city police would look for a madman or a religious zealot, while she quietly pointed the finger at the one man who couldn't defend himself. Hamish stood in the rain, the piece of the puzzle finally clicking into place. He had the motive, and he had the scent of the poison on her apron. Now, he just needed to set a trap where an invisible woman would step into the light. The rain continued to fall with a rhythmic, hypnotic drumming as Hamish Macbeth watched Mrs. Kennedy's trembling hands disappear into the folds of her wet apron. He stood by the garden gate, his lanky frame hunched in a way that suggested a man overwhelmed by the weather, rather than one who had just unmasked a killer. To the village of Lockdub, Mrs. Kennedy was the very pillar of the Kirk, a woman whose life was a series of polished surfaces and ironed linens. But Hamish knew that beneath that starched exterior lay a fierce, desperate pride that had turned a petty thief into a murderer. He didn't move to arrest her. He knew that a direct confrontation would only lead to a wall of pious denials that Blair would never have the patience to dismantle. He needed a trap, one that used her own arrogance and her fear of social ruin as the bait. "Well now, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, worried whisper. "It is a grand thing that Blair has his man, but I've just come from the hotel, and there is a bit of a problem." It seems Thorne wasn't travelling alone. He had a partner, a man from a big London insurance firm, who's arriving on the midnight bus. He's coming to do a full, scientific inventory of every piece of silver in the vault. They have some new machine, you see, an X-ray thing that can tell a Victorian copy from a 17th century original in a heartbeat. He watched her eyes. The nervous robin had returned, fluttering frantically behind her eyelids. "An inventory?" She breathed, her voice thin and sharp like a jagged piece of slate. "But the vault is sealed. Blair has the only key." Hamish scratched his red hair, looking profoundly troubled. "That's the problem." Geordie, in his panic, told Blair there was a second set of master keys hidden in the cleaning cupboard behind the altar. "Blair told me to go and fetch them, but I've a terrible headache from the rain, and I thought I'd just leave it until the morning. After all, who would go into a locked church in the middle of a storm?" He gave her a long, steady look, his hazel eyes wide and seemingly vacant of any hidden meaning. "But if that London man finds even one piece that isn't what it should be, he'll have the whole village under a microscope. It's a terrible worry for the minister." Hamish straightened, adjusting his wet cap. "I'll be off to the station now to tell Blair I couldn't find them. I expect he'll be back with a sledgehammer by dawn. Good night to you, Mrs. Kennedy. Try to get some sleep." He turned on his heel and whistled for Towser, walking away with a slow, heavy tread that suggested he was heading straight for his own bed. But once he reached the bend in the road, he didn't head for the police station. Instead, he circled back through the kirkyard, moving with the practiced silence of a man who had spent many a night, accidentally, crossing paths with a salmon that didn't belong to him. He positioned himself behind a large, lichen-covered Celtic cross that offered a clear view of the kirk's side entrance. The rain had turned into a cold, clinging mist that swallowed the mountains and turned the gravestones into ghostly sentinels. Hamish waited, his breath blooming in the air like pale smoke. He knew the psychology of a woman like Mrs. Kennedy. She couldn't risk the London expert finding her fakes, and she couldn't resist the chance to reclaim the evidence she had used to frame Geordie. To her, the church was her domain, and the thought of an outsider with a machine stripping away her respectability was more terrifying than the prospect of a murder charge. An hour crawled by then, through the grey veil of the mist. A shadow emerged from the direction of the cleaner's cottage. It moved with a frantic, scuttling energy, draped in a dark raincoat. The shadow reached the side door of the kirk, and the faint, metallic scrape of a key echoed through the silence. Hamish watched as the door swung open and the figure vanished inside. He waited another minute, counting the heartbeats before he signaled Towser and began to move. He didn't rush. He knew the vault was a dead end. As he stepped into the cold, incense-scented darkness of the church, he could hear the frantic clatter of silver coming from the area behind the altar. The trap had snapped shut. The invisible woman had returned to the scene of her crime, driven by the one thing she feared more than the law, the truth. The interior of the kirk was a cavern of velvet shadows, smelling of ancient dust, damp stone, and the sharp, lingering sting of floor wax. Hamish moved with the practiced silence of a hill fox, his boots making no sound on the worn flagstones of the nave. Towser followed at his heel, a low, vibrating growl held deep in his throat. Near the altar, a single beam of light from a pocket torch cut through the gloom, dancing frantically over the heavy silver communion plate and the ornate chalices Thorne had been so desperate to possess. The clatter of metal against stone echoed unnaturally loud in the hallowed space, a frantic, desperate sound that spoke of a woman whose world was collapsing around her ears. Hamish stopped at the edge of the chancel, the light from the torch illuminating Mrs. Kennedy's face as she worked. She was no longer the composed, pious cleaner of Lockduff. Her hair had escaped its neat bun and hung in grey, dampened streaks across her forehead, and her eyes were wide with a jagged manic intensity. She was frantically stuffing silver into a heavy burlap sack, her breath coming in sharp, shallow rasps. Beside her on the altar cloth sat a small, dark bottle, the twin to the one Blair had found in Geordie's cottage. "It is a heavy load for a lady to be carrying at this time of night, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish said, his voice soft and conversational, as if he had merely bumped into her at the post office. The torchlight swung violently toward him, blinding him for a second. Mrs. Kennedy let out a strangled, bird-like shriek, the burlap sack slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a heavy, metallic thud. She backed away toward the stone wall, her hand darting into the pocket of her raincoat. "Macbeth, you're supposed to be at the station. You said you had a headache." Hamish stepped into the circle of light, his face a mask of weary, grounded empathy. He didn't look like a threatening officer of the law. He looked like a neighbour who was profoundly disappointed. "I find the Highland air is very good for a headache, Mrs. Kennedy. Better than the air in this vault, anyway. It's thick, with the smell of bitter almonds here. It's a very distinctive scent, once a man knows what he's looking for." He was going to take it all, she hissed, her voice rising to a shrill, defensive peak. He didn't care about history or people, he just saw money. "He told me I was a thief. Macbeth. Me. I've given my life to this church. I only took the small things, the things no one missed, to pay for my sister's care in the nursing home. He was going to put me in the street, and so you lured him down there," Hamish said, taking another slow step forward. "You told him you'd show him the real treasure, the stuff not in the books. You spiked his mineral water with the cyanide you use for the wasps in the garden, and then you arranged that sword to make it look like a madman's work. You even planted the bottle on poor Geordie, knowing Blair would jump at the chance to arrest him." Mrs. Kennedy's face contorted, the pious mask shattering completely to reveal the cold, calculating woman beneath. "Geordie is a fool. He's always been a fool. The village won't miss him. But they would miss me. I am Kirk Macbeth. You can't prove anything. It's my word against a shiftless policeman who spends his days poaching." She suddenly lunged, not for the silver, but for the heavy ceremonial broadsword she had moved from the vault to the altar rail. With a strength born of pure, distilled panic, she swung the ancient blade toward Hamish's head. Hamish didn't flinch. He ducked with a fluid, athletic grace that would have stunned anyone who only knew him as the lazy village Bobby. He caught her wrists in mid-swing, his grip like iron. The sword clattered to the floor, the sound ringing through the kirk like a funeral bell. "Now then, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish panted, his face inches from hers. "That's enough theatre. You've had a long day, and the minister will be wanting his keys back." She struggled for a moment, a wild, spitting fury, before the fight suddenly went out of her. She slumped against him, a small, broken heap of damp wool and ruined pride. Hamish held her firmly but gently, looking out toward the door, where the distant, muffled sound of a car engine suggested that DCI Blair, driven by his own greed for a ledger, was about to return for the final act. The heavy oak doors of the kirk burst open with a resounding crash that shook the ancient dust from the rafters. The beam of a heavy police flashlight sliced through the incense-heavy darkness, pinning Hamish Macbeth and the weeping Mrs. Kennedy against the altar steps. DCI Blair stomped down the central aisle, his heavy boots dripping with Highland mud, followed closely by a panting Jimmy Anderson. Blair had driven back from the edge of Strathbane at breakneck speed, lured by the dispatcher's message about a hidden ledger and a named killer. His dreams of a flawless headline-grabbing arrest completely overriding his desire for a warm bed. "Macbeth," Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone arches. "What in the name of all that is holy is this? Where is the ledger? And why are you manhandling the church cleaner while the real murderer is locked in my van?" Hamish let go of Mrs. Kennedy's wrists, allowing the broken woman to sink onto a wooden pew. He picked up his dropped cap and dusted it off, adopting an expression of mild, sleepy bewilderment. "Well now, sir," Hamish said, his voice a soft, slow drawl that seemed entirely unaffected by the life or death struggle of moments ago. There is a funny thing about that ledger. I came in here seeking a bit of quiet for my headache, and I found Mrs. Kennedy instead. It seems your brilliant interrogation of poor Geordie flushed the real bird from the bush. Your relentless pressure that she panicked and came back to steal the silver to fund her escape so terrified her. Blair stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting from the scattered communion plates to the vial of bitter almonds resting on the altar cloth, and finally to the ceremonial broadsword on the floor. His mind, always greedy for a narrative that painted him as a tactical genius, began to rapidly process Hamish's quiet lie. My pressure, Blair repeated, his chest puffing out slightly beneath his damp coat. He looked at Anderson, who was staring at Hamish with a mixture of disbelief and deep, weary understanding. Yes, of course. A classic psychological squeeze. I knew that arresting the beadle would force the true culprit to make a mistake. It is standard operating procedure for a detective of my caliber. Indeed, sir, Hamish murmured, looking at the floor with deceptive humility. I was merely standing here when she confessed. She couldn't handle the thought of you tearing this place apart. It was a masterstroke, sir. I doubt there's another policeman in Scotland who could have orchestrated such a flawless trap. Blair's face transformed into a mask of smug, radiant triumph. The fact that he had been entirely wrong just an hour ago evaporated from his memory, replaced by the shiny new reality of his own brilliance. He marched over to Mrs. Kennedy, who was sobbing too hard to correct the narrative, and hauled her to her feet. You are under arrest for the murder of Reginald Thorne, Blair declared, his voice booming with theatrical authority. Anderson, get her to the van and let that sniveling beadle go. Macbeth, you can clean this mess and lock the doors. I'll make sure the chief constable knows you didn't get underfoot while I cracked the case. Hamish touched the brim of his cap. Thank you, sir. I'll just go back to my rounds then. He watched as Blair dragged the ruined woman out into the night, the heavy kirk doors thudding shut behind them. The silence of the sanctuary returned thick and comforting. Hamish carefully placed the silver back into the chest, locked the vault, and stepped out into the kirkyard. The weather had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, biting frost that turned the village into a landscape of glittering glass under the moonlight. The blue lights of the police van faded into the distance, taking the ambition, the noise, and the threat of promotion with them to Strathbane. Hamish walked back to the police station, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel. Inside, the peat fire had burned down to a welcoming, ruddy glow. Towser immediately reclaimed his spot on the rug with a heavy sigh, and Sunsy the cat opened one golden eye to judge his late return. Hamish filled a heavy iron pot with water, set it on the stove for coffee, and smiled. He was still a lowly constable. His uniform was still damp, and the world still thought him a fool. But the village was safe. The history remained buried, and the dark, smoggy streets of Glasgow were a lifetime away. Tomorrow, the skies would be clear, and the Colonel's prize salmon would be waiting in the shallows. For a lazy man, it was a perfectly successful week.